Please join me in welcoming the moderator, Samanth Subramanian, here on stage. We're still waiting for Ved Mehta. He'll be with us in a moment. But before he joins us, we have a special treat in store. We have Lynn Carey Mehta here to read for us from the essential Ved Mehta. Please help me in giving a very warm welcome to Lynn Carey.
Thank you. Ved has asked me to read from his second book, Walking the Indian Streets, which was published in 1960, first in the New Yorker magazine, and it covers a trip that he took through Nepal with Dom Moraes. A newspaper reporter, a friend of Dom's father, is our guide through Kathmandu in Nepal. By his friends, he is nicknamed Prince because he knows every stone in Nepal. He has keys to all the secret doors that open into mysterious places. He hires us a jeep, and our first visit is to a nearby village to see a great Lama, an emigre Buddhist priest from Tibet. We have an audience with him. He speaks 24 languages, and his first question to our guide is, what would we like on the language menu? After choosing English, we settle down in chairs made of tree bark to listen to the Buddhist priest. He talks like the editor of a posh magazine. He is suave, smooth, and grand. He lectures us about suffering and sacrifice, about having infinite love, about fleshly snares, about the necessity of meditation and pursuit after truth, about faith in the ancient wisdom. His day consists of 6 hours of meditation, 3 hours of prayer, 4 hours of instruction to his disciples. He counsels us to follow his path. It is very strange, because after Dom, in one of his gambits, has told him about our artistic pursuits and said that we were thinking of settling down in Nepal as permanent residents, he is no longer the great Lama, the ascetic Buddhist. He opens his cupboard and offers us some homemade gin. They don't have better gin in England, he says. We drink it avidly from imported glasses. His 3 wives serve us Chinese tea, which has a kind of mixed flavor of jasmine and gin. Then enormous plates of food are brought, after which the great Lama goes for a nap, and we are entertained by the many children of the household. Disciples of all ages and both sexes drift in and out. They seem to adore the great Lama, for they come bearing sweets and fresh vegetables, potatoes with clinging mud, and tomatoes, red and the size of apples. We walk to the center of the village in the afternoon. Prince can't go with us. He says he must get back to Kathmandu because there is a communist procession, the first such in Nepal, to protest against dalda ghee, a government-sponsored margarine that, according to the Indian Communist Party, gives people coronary thrombosis. There is no evidence for this, but since the government now allows the sale of dalda ghee, it is necessary that people should know the truth. All the adults are in the fields, except for a few old people draped over door sills, sunning themselves. The village seems to be inhabited by children alone. They follow us in a procession of 100 into the outskirts on our way to the temple and laugh at our feeble attempts to go through thickets and along one-man trails. Dom says we must get horses tomorrow because they would be more sure-footed. In the evening, there is a reception for Dom and me at the house of a poet. All the literateurs of this tiny country meet us and treat us like celebrities. We're a bit embarrassed and uncomfortable and pray that our Soho friends will not see an account of our reception in print. The beauty, the magic of Kathmandu, the mystery of concubines and palatial halls, the delicate, natural people, all make us want to be natural too, and it is difficult to be natural when being honored. Men twice our age sit with straight posture and read Nepalese poems in English and then wait for our judgment. But we have no offerings for the Nepalese gods. A terrible feeling because they ask not for sacrifices of lambs, but for little tiny comments. We pity them and feel guilty and don't know what to say. Partly it is the reading. The tone is flat and the words are lisped and whistled. Partly it is the translation, for English is a second language to the translators. Partly it is the nature of the poetry, Wordsworthian, just a little too mushy, a little too much of cows thinking pathetic fallacies.
Thank you. Can everybody hear us on stage? Long before any of us in India were practicing what we now like to call long-form journalism about India, Ved Mehta was already doing it. Long before, I'm talking about decades ago. He spent 33 years as a staff writer at The New Yorker under William Shawn. And one of his two great themes was India, the other being his family. And he must have written, I think, more words about India in a foreign publication than any other journalist I can think of. And he did it with an amazing consistency and an energy and a clarity of language that people are still looking back to with wonder. The Essential Ved Mehta, which is, in a sense, the reason we're here today, the Essential Ved Mehta is a compilation of various writings of his across the years. It's just been brought out by Penguin in hardcover. And it's a great book. It's a good book for people who are going to read Ved for the first time and have access to sort of the scope of his thinking and his description. But it's also a good book for people who read Ved for a long time. I mean, people who want to refresh their memory about just how penetrating he can be. And this gives us a chance today also, Ved, to explore, I guess, the writing arc of your life.
Thank you.
And I think this is going to be fun. I'd like to ask you a little bit to start about your early encounters with literature. I mean, what kind of literature you gravitated towards when you sought it?
Well, I didn't actually encounter any literature because my first few years were spent in an orphanage, and they'd never heard of literature as a word. Mm-hmm. I think I first time started reading fairy stories when I was 20 years old. And then I couldn't stop reading them. They seemed so much more interesting than some other literature that was sent my way. Samanth, perhaps you don't know, but I was sent to an orphanage before I was 5 years old because they didn't think a blind person could be educated any other way.
Right.
So I was there at school, sort of asylum school, with children 3 times or 4 times my age. I think one of my classmates was called Deoji, and he was 20 years old. I was 5 years old. So he was a little bit like a nurse than a fellow student. So the idea of my learning literature in an orphanage where few children could either read or write would have seemed absurd and was absurd.
And so am I right in assuming that after you moved to the United States, I believe when you were 14, was that when you started having sort of a wider access to books and found out what you like to read?
Yes, I think I was 15 when I went to the United States, and once I got to the United States and started reading Braille and started using other means of reading for a child who could not see. Then you couldn't stop me. I read everything.
And how did that, I mean, I guess this is the case with a lot of writers, is that the love of writing comes at some point from a love of reading or from what you read. And I was wondering if that's the same with you and at what age you decided or you thought that you might like to write for a living.
No, I never decided that actually. The idea of writing for a living was a weird one even after I started doing it. But you know, being placed in another culture at the age of 5, or I think I was 8, no, wait, I was 15, and all the children in Arkansas, where I was at school, didn't even know where India was. And so I had to explain them everything. So in process of explaining things to them, I learned to read and write, I think.
That's fascinating, because I was actually going to ask you, I mean, I know you've written fiction and I know you studied history, and I was wondering how over the course of your career the journalistic instinct, I guess journalistic and memoiristic instinct, proved to be stronger than the novelistic or the academic one. But I like this idea that it comes from a need to explain, or your felicity at explaining sort of parts of your life.
Well, I think that's how the idea of literature originated in my head. At least that's what it seemed like in retrospect. I haven't written much fiction. I've written some, but not much, partly because I don't think I have talent for it. I certainly have very good talent for explaining.
Right. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the first piece that you had published in the New Yorker. I mean, what the piece was also, but how it came to be published and how you came to meet William Shawn, your editor.
Well, the section of a piece that my wife Lynn read to you at the beginning of our meeting here was the first piece I wrote for the New Yorker. And I was looking for a place to publish a sort of a postscript to Face, my autobiography, which I wrote when I was about 20. And I went around to London Observer and other places, and they said, what do you want to write? As I would write a sort of a postscript to my book. And they thought the whole idea was so ridiculous. They laughed me out of the office almost. But that's how I imagined that my first piece would be like. I have a very sort of systematic mind. And the idea was that I'd written a whole book, but there were a lot of parts of my life that hadn't got into the book. So I was trying to find a way of putting them in. And so I wrote the piece as kind of a postscript. I'd met Shawn earlier. A friend of mine had given me an introduction to him. And he said he didn't think that the New Yorker or he would be interested, but if I wanted to, after I'd written it, if I wanted to send it to him, he'd be glad to give me his opinion. So on the strength of that meeting, over tea, I spent 3 weeks writing my first piece, which I called Indian Summer, and I sent it to him, expecting never to hear from him. Much to my amazement, within 3 weeks, he sent me a letter saying that he would like to publish it, and he was very delighted with the piece. And I didn't even know who was William Shawn at that point, but the fact that he was delighted with the piece gave me so much encouragement that I went and perfected the piece and then submitted it as my first piece, which appeared in the New Yorker in January 2nd, 1959, I think.
Wow. And were you at Oxford then, or were you already at Harvard?
I was at Harvard.
You were at Harvard, okay.
I was moonlighting from Harvard for writing pieces.
As do we all. I wondered at the surprising appetite of the New Yorker and of Shawn himself for stories about India. I mean, you've mentioned this often, is that it takes a certain amount of courage of thought on the part of the editor to, for example, run a 3-part series on Mamaji. And was this something that was intrinsic to Shawn as a person? Does it reflect him in any way?
No, Shawn was a very curious man. He could not ever resist a piece that was written that satisfied some curiosity of his, and his curiosity was ever alert. So I don't think he had any particular interest in India. In fact, he told me he had none when he started publishing my pieces. And in those days, Samanth, you might know, or maybe you're too young to know, but books about India, I don't think I ever saw the light of day in printing presses, because it was considered that India was a place where hungry people and poor people roamed about asking for money. And that was not the, quote, image, end of quote, that any publisher wanted to have for his book. I think Sean just liked the writing. It wasn't the subject matter, but the writing that he cared about.
And in a way, it was sort of it was very fortuitous meeting, because I think in you he had found this writer who could write about something like India and bring it alive for an American reader, but also in him you found an editor who published that kind of piece, whereas I don't think many other editors at the time might have. Or correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, I'm not sure.
No, I think you're right, but there were some other people who were writing about India at that time. One was Shanta Rama Rao, a woman writer. Another was a New Yorker writer called, gosh, his name has just flown out of my head. I think he was called Rand. Anyway, so it wasn't that New Yorker never had pieces about India. Emily Hahn was another writer who had been writing about India. Mr. Sean, as we called him, never worried about who was writing what or who were the writers. All he cared was how good the writing was. And he had an impeccable taste and judgment.
There's a lovely line that Ved uses somewhere that I'd love to repeat. He talks about a good editor being, quote, a midwife, not an impregnator. I think that's a fantastic way to, and we all wish that we had sort of editors like that. It's a fantastic description. The other thing that was, that came up possibly when you started writing for the New Yorker is this art that you developed or perhaps already had of using a very small specific story to illuminate and illustrate a much bigger idea or a bigger story. And I know that this is, in a sense, part of the tradition of American long-form journalism, but I was curious to see whether that was something that just came naturally to you, or whether it was something you admired in what you had read or heard.
No, I really, when I started writing for the New Yorker, now, which I did for, 30-some years, I never really read the New Yorker very much. If I did, it was very selective. And it wasn't that it was New Yorker that interested me, but I just was very fascinated by long form of writing where you could explore people's feelings and thoughts and images. And I'm afraid at the time there weren't many magazines who did that. One was a magazine called Holiday. And, but aside from Holiday, there was really very little.
Right. Do you read the New Yorker now? I'm curious.
No, I haven't read it for some years.
Okay, because I think after Sean, of course, there was Robert Gottlieb, who was there for a little time, but I think when you finally left, it was, Tina Brown was the editor, and I was wondering what you thought of the magazine under her editorship or her stewardship.
I think I'd rather plead the Fifth Amendment.
Fair enough. Tina Brown is a friend of the Jaipur Literary Festival, so I think we should move right along. It's fascinating that, over decades, you spent decades in the US and you built a life there, but yet you kept returning to this sort of one great theme in your writing, which is India itself. And I'm curious whether at some point you had ever felt the impulse to explore America, your adopted land, in the same kind of reportorial way that you did India.
I certainly wrote a lot about things set in America, but because I knew the Indian languages, my mother tongue, I was drawn to India the way one is drawn to one's mother if one speaks to her in her own language. Although my mother and I had a very turbulent relationship, she couldn't read or write, which became my passion. She had many other wonderful qualities, but reading and writing was not two of them. Therefore, I was drawn closer to my father, who was a doctor in public health, who spoke English, and I think I revered him because he could speak English. I felt kind of at a disadvantage that I couldn't.
That's an interesting place perhaps to ask what the varying reaction was from your mother and your father when you started writing about them, when you started writing Daddy Ji and then Mama Ji.
I think the truth is that we know our parents never as people. We always know them as these authority figures. And I was very fortunate that I came up on the idea that I would like to explore my parents as people. What were they like when they were, in case of my father in his office, or in case of my mother as she was bargaining with with people who sold fruit on the street. My mother was a terrific bargainer. She could start out offering very little money for a parcel of oranges, and even after that she could bring down the price. So I learned by just observing and being around them.
And since she wasn't a sort of too much of a reader, was she receptive to your idea of writing about her?
No.
So how did you get around that?
Well, because I got my father to cooperate with my idea. And my father was very interested because he was a reader and he knew what a good writing was. In fact, he helped correct my many articles and mistakes in the articles. Wow. And so it was through my father that I appealed to her, and also by my own sort of affection for her.
Right. I'd just like to ask one more sort of question about your time at the New Yorker before we move on to Continents of Exile. The New Yorker as an institution is something that you describe vividly in Remembering Mr. Sean. And I was hoping to ask what it was like for a writer, both of your strengths and your weaknesses, to be able to work in an institution like that where there was a certain amount of freedom that was given to writers. There were no sort of deadlines, there were no commissions per se. Was it nerve-wracking in one way and liberating in another? How would
well, I think you put your finger on it. It was liberating in the sense there were no demands of any kind made on one, but it was nerve-wracking because we were only paid by what was published in the magazine. It was hard enough to write something, but then to get it published in the New Yorker, which at the time was a little bit like the Metropolitan Opera. There was only one venue with as writings the kind I did and other New Yorker writers did could be published, and that was in the New Yorker. On the other hand, I think even though there were no openings for New Yorker pieces in other magazines, still the very fact that the New Yorker existed and gave us this freedom to write whatever we chose to write about with no qualifications was really very exciting.
Right. Your other great subject, which is this series of books called Continents of Exile, traces in a way your development of yourself but also of your family, and it spans sort of many generations and decades. And it started with your first book, Face to Face, in a way. I'd like to ask about this word exile that you use in the title of the series. It's a curious word because in a sense your exile wasn't imposed on you and it wasn't self-imposed. So I'd like to ask what you felt exiled from, or where this sense of exile came into the writing that you did about yourself and your family.
Well, I felt exiled from the language, which was my mother tongue. I felt exiled from home. I mean, I was born in Lahore, and here I was living in New York. I felt exiled from my family. I was one of 7 children, and I couldn't see my brother or sisters. In those days, you couldn't even telephone. If you telephoned, after 3 minutes, the operator would come and say, your time is up, and she would disconnect you. We've got used to this new kind of telephone. You can talk as long as you want with no worry about money, that kind of thing. That wasn't the case when I went to America. In fact, I lived in America maybe, 20 years in the beginning, and I never heard the voice of my mother, but once. Wow. When they went to some kind of exhibition and they were given a time to record something, and they recorded a small disc, and I remember playing that disc over and over and over again to see if I could recognize my mother's voice, and I couldn't.
That's remarkable. Did you ever want to come back then? I mean, if the sense of exile was so strong, did you ever want to return to India?
I wanted to return to my home, but there had been partition in the intervening years. There was no way of going back to Lahore, and that's where all my childhood associations were. So really, I knew from the day I left India that I wouldn't be able to come back easily to the country to live. And actually, I find living in India very difficult. Someone with my problems cannot cope with the anarchy which is India. I think Galbraith once said India was a functioning anarchy. And anarchy is fine if you can see, but if you can't see, it's very hard.
I think it's sometimes hard even if you can see, believe me. We all feel that way sometimes. What is it like for a writer to work through this theme of self and family in the numerous books that you read? I mean, how did your perspective of yourself and of your family shift as you, in a sense, almost cathartically put down these experiences and these memories on paper?
Well, I think there were several things that went into it. One was years of reflection. When you're writing, you have many, many hours, sometimes years of reflection. The other was I was psychoanalyzed for about 7, 8 years, and that also sharpened my perspective. Another element was just having conversations with all the people that I met and encountered who couldn't understand what I was saying, and I couldn't understand often what they were saying. But we both had to explain to each other what was being said. Mm-hmm. The communication now we take for granted. Everybody travels around in jet airlines and can understand, we can understand each other. And then there is the BBC or some other radio network which can carry the messages over. But when I was there in those early days, there was no such institution. And when it came into existence, it was thrilling.
And sorry, just to go back to this question which I'm interested in is about, did it change the way you looked at yourself or you looked at your family at the end of all of this? I mean, how does such a cathartic experience feel at the end of 10 odd books on yourself and your family?
Well, I think every book changed me. Every time I wrote a book, I thought I would be the same person who wrote the book and the person who was there at the end of it. But the truth is, every book, every piece of writing does change one if you write it seriously. And I think throughout there have been many changes, internal and external, in the course of writing my books.
And was it ever daunting to, I guess, expose your interiority, your interior life and your thoughts so repeatedly in several memoirs? I mean, you're one of the most prolific memoirists, I think, of our time. And I can't think of anybody else who's written sort of so much about the way he or she thinks, the psychology that he or she perceives within himself or herself.
Well, I think, of course, you're right. I never thought of this book as memoirs. That's a journalistic cliche that I don't really subscribe to. But every time I published a book about an incident or something, thinking over something that I had done or not done changed not only the writing, but also what I thought about what I had written. And that went right through my writing life.
Okay. I think we have about 10 minutes more before we wrap this up, 10 or 15 minutes. So I'd like to open this up for questions. I think there are microphones that will float around. But if you have any questions for Ved about all of his writing or anything else, we can open it up. There's somebody there?
A fascinating study, and I really enjoyed very much what you were saying today. One of the curious questions I would like to ask is that you initially said that you were an orphan, and yet much of the later part of your discussion was about your parents. So there seems to me a slight gap there that I would love you to fill, and I think for a lot of people who don't know your work so very well would be fascinated to know how you ended up in America.
I didn't follow that question. Can you?
Well, I mean, the first part I think I can explain very quickly. Ved was sent to a school in Bombay that was ostensibly run as an orphanage, but was actually a school for children who had lost their sight. and it was one of the few schools in India that was catering to such children, and so therefore Ved's father sent him down there. But it's an interest. The other part of the question was about how you went to America and how that move came about.
Oh, well, you know, my father was a great believer in getting children Western education. And I put in my application to go to Perkins, which is the best known education for the blind in the United States, when I was 8 years old, and I found my letter that I did at the time. But it was in the middle of the war, and no one was taking any children from outside India in those days. I wasn't able to get admission in the United States, which was necessary before you could get a visa, until after the war had ended. I think in 1946 was when that became possible. I must have been one of the first people to apply, and I was admitted to a very little known rural state school called Arkansas School for the Blind. I don't think anybody here can imagine what an Indian child going to Arkansas in 1949 would have been like. I thoroughly enjoyed it because I'd made up my mind I was going to like it. I've been waiting for it for such a long time. But Arkansas was a backward state, and it was very difficult for them to even get their arms around that I was from India. I went to see Senator Fulbright at one time, and he said, "Don't mention India when you talked about your background, because no one here has ever heard of India." So it was a real awakening. Did you have any follow-up?
Yes, we do, yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to say I read Face to Face decades ago. I must have been very young. I was very young and I was in college. And it was one of the books that made such an impression upon my mind. And now, a couple of years ago, I've been diagnosed with glaucoma and I've lost vision in one eye. And believe me, I keep going back to that book and to your courage, and I really don't know how to say this, but I feel extremely honored sitting here listening to you, sir.
That's not a question, Samanth.
It's not.
A compliment. Thank you.
It's a very warm compliment.
Yeah.
There's one more question here.
Mr. Mehta, what were your family's plans for you before you apprised them of your ambition to proceed to America?
What were your family's plans for you before you moved to America?
My family's plan, actually it was not my family's, my grandfather, my mother's father's plan was to open me a little shop in somewhere like Connaught Place in Delhi and fill that shop with Indian instruments. I was quite talented musically when I was a child, and everybody thought of me not as a writer but as possible musician. And my grandfather's idea was, and therefore also my mother's idea, he was my mother's father, was to establish me a shop and make me into a shopkeeper. I actually deplored the idea, although my mother never stopped pointing out that the only blind tutor they knew was a musician, and he went around everywhere in a tonga. That was a sign of affluence among Indian teachers. But I had no interest in getting a tonga, no interest in having an Indian shop. What I was interested in was getting some education, learning to read and write. And I remember when I first heard the name Virginia Woolf, how excited I was. I don't know how that happened. Why was it that, unlike other children in India, I wasn't interested in earning my keep. I was only interested in learning what I now think of higher things.
Over there.
this very curious concept of a piece of writing changing the author. Could you elaborate a little more on that? And if that were to happen, it will become very difficult for a biographer to track the original author.
To elaborate upon how a piece of writing changes an author, which you had mentioned earlier. And the second part was?
In that case, how will a biographer deal with the life of an author? Because there will be no consistency and it will be frequently changing with every piece of writing.
Okay. And the second part, I guess, if you were to write a biography of an author, the author's life in a way would be changed with every book he or she wrote. And so it would appear to an outside eye to be an inconsistent life.
Interested in what, Samanth?
An inconsistent life.
Oh, inconsistent. Oh, well, I suppose writers are always inconsistent in terms of their books. Well, I don't know. I mean, the way one is changed internally, there are things one can't even think of when one is writing. And then one writes them and they seem like second nature. I remember what difficulty I had even in articulating the word sex. And I couldn't really write about any sexual things. But then when I came down to writing, I discovered it was one of the most liberating subjects I could have. Now, I've not written much about sex because I don't think it's quite germane to what I've been writing, but I certainly feel free to write anything I want to. I'm not worried about someone lowering the boom on my head because I've written about a forbidden subject.
Are there any more questions? Yes, there's a couple over there.
Yes, Mr. Mehta. As an Indian author in the United States, I understand that you had this feeling of exile throughout your journalistic career, the 30-year journalistic career that you had. Did this feeling of exile sort of manifest in an attraction towards long-form journalism in India and the journalism sector in India? Were you at all interested in following the sector and sort of writing for publications? I mean, I can see now Mr. Subramanian and others, brilliant long-form writers in India, but were you at all interested towards that prospect then over the course of your career?
Did you ever want to write for Indian publications when you were?
Well, I've never thought of writing for any publication. I think the death of a writer is when he starts worrying about who the audience of his writing is. Because then you don't have the freedom, then you're always trying to, you're doing what I call a programmatic writing. I've never thought of myself as an Indian writer or an English writer or any other kind of writer. I've just thought of myself as a, quote, writer belonging to an open fraternity of writers no matter where they live. So when I was reading Dostoevsky or Tolstoy as a student, I felt closer affinity to them than I did to American writers like Henry James. I thought they spoke to me in a way that Henry James didn't. Of course, this changed as I grew older and understood what Henry James was trying to do. So that I've never thought of myself as an Indian writer, and I don't think I am, because most of my experience has been outside India, in England and America, and consequently I can't imagine myself being either thinking of myself as an Indian writer or anyone outside my immediate world thinking of me merely just an Indian writer. Does that answer your question?
I think he looks happy. Yeah, he's smiling. There's one more question over there behind.
Hello. Hi, sir. With all due respect, I appreciate the way you just got treated. And you learned a lot from your life. How about the memories, what to say, DEAD memories? How you overcome the time you came to know, what's happening, what's going around on you, around you. I mean, how can you manage it? I'm sorry this time, I just cannot see at all. I just wanna, just close both of my eyes and just wanna listen to you. how about them dead memories which still haunting around in me? I'm asking about myself actually. I do write sometimes, I paint, I do some kind of sketching and all, but I just cannot overcome them dead memories. I mean, it, why discrimination all over? Why?
Sorry, when you say dead memories, what do you mean?
All those people who are not around and still people for no reason.
Memories of the dead, you mean?
Uh, okay, let me remove this DEAD word from here. Memories, just memories.
Okay.
Memories could be of anything if, you know. What's your name, by the way, sir? I'm sorry, I just forgot to ask your name.
So he's asking sort of how much memory fuels your work, I guess, and how...
No, my question is a bit different. How you overcome on those memories? I mean, how you bypass those memories?
Painful memories, you mean?
Memories, I mean the things which has been changed and you cannot go back and just, you know, you can do nothing about it.
Well,
I mean, what happened?
Okay, well, I mean, I guess it's a good segue into just asking how your writing responds to memories of yours that are not only happy but painful in a way, and how and whether the writing is useful, cathartic in a way at dealing with the pain of some of what you've experienced.
I really don't know how to answer the question. I know from having read Freud quite a lot and modern literature quite a lot that memories which you think are pure and true often are, quote, screen memories. In other words, you don't remember exactly what happened, or even if you remember, something else intervenes and gives the memory a particular cast which is not really true necessarily. You think you're writing a memory about your father, but it may be you're writing a memory about your mother. I mean, that's how different a memory can be. I think all I can say anyway, as a writer is when you know that memories can disguise themselves in the unconscious, you tend to be terribly careful, and every time you think you have an accurate memory, you investigate it to make sure it is accurate. Memories, I think, is a slippery slope, and as you know, if you've ever had to do with a law case, what you think you remember for certain turns out not to be true.
Right, that's very interesting. There was one question there at the back.
Hello, sir. Good afternoon. It's a privilege to be sitting here listening to you. I'd like to know which is your favorite work done by you.
She wants to know which of your books remains closest to your heart or your favorite. Is that something that a writer thinks about?
Well, no. Usually the last book is my favorite because I think to choose among books and separate those that are favorite is asking father, who's your favorite child? I think a parent doesn't have a favorite child. They're all favorite to him equally, have different strengths to be sure, but you don't have one that stands out as one's favorite.
Okay. Do we have any more? Maybe we'll have a couple more questions and then wind down.
Mr. Mehta, when you, I think in A Portrait of India, you have a chapter, if I'm not mistaken, about Satyajit Ray. And I just wanted to know if you have met him, whether you, some level, because in certain ways, Ray's work looked to a lot of Indian topics, which was very popular in the West, and in a way in which you look towards India. So when you met him, in certain way, did you connect with his vision, or could you give us a little bit of that experience of yours?
Did you share, when you met Satyajit Ray for your profile of him, did you share a certain vision of India that, and did you find that you had a connection with him that was above what is common with a writer in his profile subject?
Well, I don't know what would be accurate description of Ray. I could only report on my impression of meeting him, but beneath that and beyond that was my impression of having seen his films, which of course had to be described to me. And I found that Ray was exactly like the person I would have imagined if I could have seen his films. Is that the question, though?
Does that answer your question a little bit? Okay. We'll have one last question. There's two people putting their hands up here, so maybe one of the two or both. Yes, sir.
मैं ये जानना चाह रहा हूँ, आप चूंकि हिंदुस्तानी हैं, तो क्या हिंदी में सोचते हैं और अंग्रेजी में लिखते हैं?
अच्छा,
यानी आपके लिखने की भाषा और सोचने की भाषा एक है या दो है?
That's interesting, and it's interesting given you said that you also felt exile at some point from your home language, your mother tongue. Do you think in Hindi or do you write in, do you think in English, and what is the process that happens between thinking in Hindi and writing in English?
Well, you know, when I started to read, there was no alphabet for writing Hindi in Braille. So I really never learned to write in Hindi. I wrote everything in English. That's what Braille was there for. And I often used to think that was a terrific handicap. But the truth is that as the time went on, I compromised and did the best I could with the English Braille. And so now I can confidently say that I'm equally fluent in writing English or Hindi. But this is a lie, because if I now read a writer like Prem Chand, for instance, or even the legend, what do you say, that Doli Chad ke Heer Maria, I mean, Heer ne, do you know the words to that? Chika Maria, I think that's what it is. I feel that I understand what she's saying and why she's crying so much.
And what language do you think in?
It depends. When I'm in India and I'm with my mother, was with my mother, I would think in Hindi. When I'm in England or with English people, I think in English. I think it has to be said that my consciousness is an amalgam. Hindi, English, whatever is at hand.
Okay. Yes.
It's a pleasure to see Mr. Mehta in Jaipur. It was a rare dream come true. I want to change a shift in the discourse. You have been observing India and lots of structural changes in India, and many great writers, including you, do worry about or are very happy what is happening in India. I give an example. Anand Murthy once said, if Modi becomes Prime Minister of India, I will leave the country. I want to ask you, Mr. Ved Mehta, how are you thinking about new changes in India and the ideological shift taking place in this country? Do you ever did you ever think about that what is happening in India, sir?
Do you ever think about the ideological political shifts that are happening in India? I mean, there are people who are talking about, Narendra Modi, for instance, as a possible leader for the country, and he was wondering, not me, whether you have given much thought to the shifts in ideology within the country and how that impacts you or makes you feel.
Yeah, I must say I've given a great deal of thought to Modi. I think I myself think he'd a great danger to India. Now my brothers and sisters may not agree with it, and you may not agree with it, but he strikes me as having certain fascistic element in his thinking, especially when it comes to communal questions like Hindus and Muslims. I'm born a secularist, and I'll remain a secularist as long as I live. I don't think that any religion has dominance over thinking of most people in India. India is a secular country. We've lived under the Mughals, we've lived under the British, and we've also lived under Hindu leaders like the one who fled to Japan. Who was that?
Bose? Subhash Chandra
Bose, Subhash Chandra Bose. I really think that the world is too intolerant a place as it is, that greater an interest in toleration, the better the country will be and the better the world will be.
I think that's a good note on which to end this discussion. Thank you, Ved, for being with us today. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Let's give another warm thanks to Ved Mehta and Samanth Subramanian. This session was proudly presented by DNA. That brings us to lunchtime, but please don't go away because here on the front lawns we're going to be having a book launch. The book is Shahnaz Hussain, Ek Hubsarat Zindagi. It's by Nelufar Karimboy. We'll be launching the book in about 5 minutes, so please do join us.